Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're tackling a question that I bet you've thought about at some point. Is there a universal right and wrong?
Or does it all just depend on your perspective?
Yeah. So we're going deep into the philosophy of morality today to try to unpack those objective and subjective views. What do you think?
I'm excited about this one because the sources you've given us are really diverse. We've got some academic back and forth on objective and subjective morality, a look at natural law theory, but through this really interesting lens of Al-Ghazali.
Who was a prominent Islamic philosopher, by the way, for anyone who
Exactly.
hasn't heard of him.
And even an article that tries to dig into how those two seemingly opposing views might actually connect, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, so get ready because we're going to unpack if your upbringing shapes your sense of right and wrong, if there really are universal moral truths out there, and maybe even if saying that's wrong is more like cheering for your team than like stating a fact.
It's like rooting for your side.
Totally, yeah. So the first source jumps right into this debate with some examples that, people might recognize from their own lives. Like most people would agree that taking care of your children is good, right?
Right.
It seems pretty straightforward.
Seems pretty straightforward.
But then you have other things like polygamy, where opinions are all over the place.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And I think this gets to the heart of the difference between like those morals that we just kind of accept and the ones that we constantly debate.
It does.
What do you think?
Absolutely. And even, taking it a step further, like, is it wrong to eat meat?
Yeah.
Some people are going to be completely against it. Others are,
Firing up the grill right now.
Exactly.
So where do we draw the line between what's a personal belief and what's like, I don't know, a universal rule that everybody should follow?
Well, that's where this idea of objective morality comes in. It's the idea that moral truths exist no matter what you or I or anybody else believes. It's kind of like gravity. You can't just choose not to believe in gravity because if you trip, you're going down.
Right, yeah. But then how do we explain all the disagreements about moral issues? If it's like gravity, shouldn't we all just hit it?
Yeah, you would think so, right? But that's the question that's been stumping philosophers forever. The source actually brings up a historical example to kind of illustrate this. A guy named John Hampden, who was a big deal in the English Civil War, he was totally convinced that he was acting morally, but objectively, based on what was going on, he was in the wrong.
Oh, wow.
It makes you wonder, was he like subjectively right, even if objectively wrong?
So then is subjective morality basically saying like, it's all relative, man. What's right for me could be wrong for you, and like, who's really to say?
Well, not quite. I mean, it does acknowledge that there are different perspectives, but it also ties into this idea of a person's character and whether they're really to blame for their actions, Think about someone who punishes an innocent person because they had bad information.
Yeah.
Objectively, they acted wrongly, but their understanding at the time, their subjective viewpoint shapes how we judge them.
So it's like less black and white. It's not just about if an action is universally right or wrong, but also about what the person understood and intended.
Exactly. And that brings us to natural law theory. Have you ever felt like there's just this innate sense of right and wrong, like it's just built into how the universe works? Well, that's kind of what natural law theory is all about. It argues that there are objective moral norms rooted in human nature, and we can discover them through reason.
Okay.
Our second source explores this through Al-Ghazali.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he's pretty fascinating.
So is he saying like we can figure out right and wrong just by looking at ourselves, at what it means to be human?
He goes even further than that, actually. He argues that humans have a specific purpose, and morality flows from that purpose.
Okay.
And to illustrate this, he compares us to, well, get this, cattle, wild beasts, demons, and angels.
Wow, that's
It's a lot.
quite the comparison.
Yeah, but he says the thing that separates humans is our intellect, our angelic side. It's what allows us to understand God and resist those, primate urges that we share with beasts.
Right. But hold on, didn't Al-Ghazali also believe that ultimately God decides what's moral?
Yeah, he did.
Doesn't that kind of make it subjective, though, since like God's will isn't exactly something we can measure?
That's where things get interesting. You've got some scholars like George Harani who argue that Ghazali's focus on God's will kind of clashes with the whole natural law idea.
Okay, I see.
It's like saying morality is just whatever God decides, end of story.
Which could lead to some pretty random rules depending on your interpretation.
Yeah, exactly. But then you have other scholars like Andrew Eman who interpret Ghazali a bit differently. They see his emphasis on reason and human nature as being compatible with a softer version of natural law.
Okay.
It's more like saying that God designed the universe with these built-in moral principles, and it's our job as humans to use reason to figure them out.
Oh, so not just random commands from like up above, but more like God created this moral compass and we're trying to learn how to read it.
Precisely. And Ghazali was big on the role of the heart, or quab.
The quals.
Yeah, in moral knowledge. He believed that purifying the heart is what allows our intellect to function correctly, to really grasp those moral truths.
I kind of get that. It's like when you're super angry, it's hard to think straight.
Exactly. Emotions cloud judgment.
Totally.
Now, our last source tackles what it calls the explanatory question.
Okay.
This is where things get pretty complex. How do we actually connect those big objective moral truths with our individual subjective sense of what we should do, right?
That's what I've been wondering this whole time. Like, it seems like there's a gap there.
You're right, there is. The source calls the traditional approach the idea that your obligation to do something is based on what would be universally required if all your beliefs were true. So it's a lot of what ifs.
Okay, so like, if I believe X is true, and if X being true means I should do Y, then I should do Y even if X isn't actually true.
You got it. But the source throws a wrench in that with this example of a driver at a blind intersection. Say you're running late, right, and you think nobody's coming, but you can't be certain.
Yeah.
Objectively, you should slow down. But based on how you understand the situation, you might just speed through because you think it's safe.
So the traditional view would say, like, don't speed through because objectively it's wrong. But my reasoning might tell me to go for it.
Exactly. And the source argues that this kind of shows a flaw in that traditional view. Our reasoning, based on what we believe at the time, can sometimes lead us to do something that's not universally right, but is understandable given what we believe.
This is definitely getting nuanced.
It is.
So how do we take into account that individual sense of morality if the traditional explanation doesn't really work?
Well, the source presents this alternative that centers on what it calls subjective reasons and how they relate to those objective moral truths we were talking about.
Okay, so I'm following you so far, but now I'm kind of wondering, what makes a subjective reason different from just, like, thinking something is right or wrong?
It really comes down to, what's informing that thought process. What are you basing it on? Subjective reasons are those reasons that come from your beliefs and experiences.
Okay.
Whereas those objective reasons, the ones we were talking about before, they exist regardless of your personal view.
Right.
They're just out there whether you agree with them or even know about them.
So it's kind of like, just trying to think of a good example.
Okay, sure.
Imagine you're a judge, right?
Okay, yeah.
And you're deciding if you should punish someone for a crime. You might believe they're guilty based on the evidence that was presented.
Right.
So that's your, like, subjective reason for wanting to punish them.
Exactly.
But the objective reason would be whether they actually committed the crime or not, regardless of what you believe.
Exactly. That's it.
So my subjective reasons are, like, filtered through my own understanding of how the world works.
Precisely.
Like, I might think it's okay to bend the rules sometimes if it helps someone that I care about.
Right.
That would be a subjective reason.
That's a good example.
Okay.
And what the source argues is that the strength of a subjective reason depends on two things: how strongly you believe that something is true,
Okay.
and the objective weight of the corresponding objective reason.
Hold on. So we've got how much I believe something is true. That's one part.
Yep.
And now we've got this objective weight thing.
Uh-huh.
Break that down for me.
Okay, so let's go back to that judge example, right?
Okay.
Punishing the guilty, most people would agree that's morally important.
Right.
That's the objective weight of that reason, right?
Okay.
That inherent importance then influences how strong your subjective reason is for wanting to punish that person.
So it's like my belief is one part of it,
Yeah,
but how universally important the reason itself is plays a role too.
you got it.
Okay.
And the source argue that this actually explains better how we actually make moral decisions, than that traditional view we were talking about.
Okay.
It can account for those times when our reasoning might lead us to do something that, isn't universally right.
Right.
But it's understandable given what we believe.
This makes me think about, like, those cultural differences we see all the time.
Yeah,
Like what's polite in one culture might be rude in another culture.
right.
Is that kind of where this subjective reasoning comes in?
I think that's a great connection because remember, we were talking about those different ideas about human nature with Al-Ghazali.
Mm-hmm.
So if one culture, say, values individual freedom and self-expression, while another values harmony and, respect for authority,
Yeah.
you're going to have totally different starting points for what's right and wrong, right?
So even if we all agree that it's wrong to harm innocent people, our reasons for believing that could be totally different.
Exactly. And that's where things get really fascinating.
Yeah.
Because you might think you're agreeing on this moral principle, but underneath you have all these layers of different interpretations and reasoning that are shaped by your background.
This is kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
Yeah, deep.
But I feel like I'm starting to see that bigger picture.
Yeah.
It's not just about finding this one set of rules that everybody agrees on. It's more about understanding how all those pieces fit together.
Yeah.
Those universal truths, how my culture interprets those truths, and my own personal reasons for believing them.
That's a great way to put it.
And that's why I think, conversations like this are so important.
I agree.
They help us realize our own biases, understand different perspectives, and just approach these moral questions with more nuance and maybe a little humility.
Absolutely. We started out trying to figure out, is morality objective or subjective?
Yeah.
And I think what we're realizing is it's probably somewhere in between.
Yeah.
It's not an either-or thing. I think both of these perspectives have something really valuable to offer, and recognizing that makes for a much richer understanding of how we actually make these decisions.
It's almost like we're all navigating this really complex moral landscape, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And we need both that universal map and our own personal compass to really figure out where we're going.
I love that. And it highlights, I think, why it's so important to reflect and think critically when it comes to these choices.
Yeah.
Being willing to question our own beliefs, especially when those beliefs have real-world consequences for others.
And remember that point the source made about, our subjective reasons being based on things we can actually do?
Right.
That's pretty important, too. Good intentions are great, but, doesn't mean we don't have to make sure our beliefs are realistic.
Exactly. Which brings up this question of blameworthiness, If our reasoning can sometimes lead us to make choices that are objectively wrong.
Right.
Does that let us off the hook?
Are you saying, if I genuinely believe that I'm doing the right thing, even if it turns out I was wrong, that I can't be held accountable?
No, not quite. It's more nuanced than that. Remember, even those subjective reasons are still connected to those objective moral truths.
Right.
And the source is emphasizing that those objective reasons should always be things that we can actually achieve.
So, going back to my example, if I believe that I can fly and try to save someone from a burning building,
Right.
I'm not off the hook just because I had good intentions.
Exactly. Because your subjective reason to fly was based on a false belief about your ability.
Yeah.
Right? It's not grounded in reality.
Okay.
We can't just wish away those objective limitations.
So it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's more about, understanding that connection between what we believe, what's possible, and how those things shape our choices.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, because the source actually argues that this view,
Okay.
focusing on those subjective reasons and how they connect to objective moral truths, actually helps address some of the biggest challenges to both objective and subjective morality.
Oh, wow. What kind of challenges are we talking about?
Well, there are a few key objections that philosophers have been struggling with forever. The source calls them the information objection, the Jackson cases objection, and the ought implies can objection. And it argues that this view we've been talking about can handle these objections better than the traditional approach.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. I'm ready for round 2 of, philosophical sparring.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's break down these objections. Hit me with that first one. What's the information objection all about?
Well, it basically goes back to that question we were wrestling with earlier, Is simply knowing what's universally right enough to figure out what you should do in your own life.
Right.
And this objection argues that no, it's not enough, especially when we're dealing with limited information and we've got our own personal beliefs mixed in there.
So, knowing stealing is wrong in general doesn't tell me what to do if I'm starving and have to choose between stealing food or letting my family go hungry.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. And the source argues that those kinds of dilemmas really highlight how objective morality alone can't give us all the answers,
Right.
Remember how we were talking about the objective weight of moral reasons?
Yeah.
Well, that's where this alternative view really shines, because it's not just about knowing, stealing is wrong. It's about understanding how objectively bad it is to steal in that specific situation, taking into account all the factors involved.
So it's not just stealing is wrong. It's how wrong is stealing in this specific case, given what I know and what I believe.
Precisely. And our subjective reasoning takes both of those things into account, right? The objective weight of that moral principle and how strongly we believe in it.
Okay, I'm seeing how that addresses the information objection. But what about those Jackson cases, those situations where someone knowingly chooses to do something they believe is objectively wrong?
Right.
How does this alternative view handle that?
Well, remember how the traditional view struggles with these cases?
Yeah, because it's so tied to those universal truths, right?
Exactly. It's like saying if you believe something is wrong, you can never ever do it, no matter what. But this alternative view allows for more flexibility, you know?
Because it recognizes that sometimes our own personal reasons might actually outweigh what we understand to be objectively right.
Precisely. Like, think about that miner scenario, right?
Yeah.
You're forced to choose which mine shaft to block, knowing that whoever's in the other shaft is going to buy.
Horrible choice.
Objectively, blocking one of the shafts is the right thing you do, but those personal reasons
The uncertainty, the possibility of a terrible outcome.
exactly might make you hesitate, even though you know what you shouldn't do.
So even though I understand objectively it's the right choice to make, my own reasoning might pull me in another direction because of how strongly I feel about those other factors.
Exactly. And that's where that idea of credence, how strongly we believe something, comes in again. Even though you know that blocking the shaft is the right choice, your belief in that might be weakened by all those other really heavy considerations.
Right.
And this alternative view allows for those situations and provides a more compassionate way of understanding how people make those really difficult choices.
It's not about just ignoring what's right. It's about how all these different factors play into our thought processes when we're making a tough decision.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what about that last objection? The ought implies can problem. How does this framework we've been talking about make sure we're not setting ourselves up for failure, basically? Holding ourselves to standards that are impossible to meet.
Well, that's where that connection between objective moral truths and our personal reasons becomes really important. Remember how the source argues that those objective reasons, those universal principles, should always be things that we can actually achieve.
Right.
And because our subjective reasons are based on those objective reasons, well, it follows that we shouldn't be obligated to do things that are impossible, right?
So back to my flying example. Even if I believe I can fly and I want to save someone from a burning building, I'm not actually morally obligated to do that because, newsflash, I can't fly.
Exactly. Your subjective reason to fly was based on, well, a false belief about what you're capable of, a belief that doesn't match up with reality.
Right.
And it highlights how important it is to, be honest with ourselves about our limitations, right?
Yeah.
And make sure that our beliefs are based on what's actually possible.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. It's really made me rethink how I approach these kinds of moral questions and how complicated they really are.
Me too. It's been a fascinating exploration, and I think you've hit on something really important. It's not about finding the perfect answer or a set of rules to follow without question. It's about understanding all the different pieces of the puzzle.
The universal truths, our beliefs, the weight we give different reasons.
Exactly, and using that understanding to try to make the most thoughtful decision we can.
Well said. I feel like we started out trying to decide, is morality objective or subjective?
Mm-hmm.
And what we've discovered is that the answer is much more nuanced than that.
It really is. It's not an either-or situation. Both perspectives have something to offer, and this framework we've been talking about really shows how those seemingly opposite ideas can actually work together.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a mind-blowing deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools for thinking about these moral questions, and I'm sure our listeners do too.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and I hope everyone listening has enjoyed it as well.
And remember, folks, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.